Hi, I'm Tyler Fertel, here joined by actor, comedian, and writer Robert Wuhl. Mr. Wuhl, thank you very, very much for joining me here today.
My pleasure, Mr. T.
And I want to get started here by talking about maybe your biggest role in the film industry, and that was as being the creator, the star, and the co-executive producer of HBO show Arliss. And obviously, you portrayed the character Arliss Michaels, and your signature line was, "My name is Arliss Michaels. I represent athletes. These are my stories." And so I just want to get started here with the podcast talking, how did you really come up with the idea for the show Arliss? And did you get inspiration from somewhere, or what research did you do to really develop your character? Just talk about the show overall.
I was approached in 93, 94, 19, by Mike Tolan and David Picker, a famous producer and used to run a studio, about going to HBO with their idea was a Spinal Tap of sports. And they came to me, and because I had also written Police Squad, which was, so another thing. So they came to me, and I had a relationship with HBO. So, and they asked about Spinal Tap of sports, and I came back saying, well, I've kind of seen that, but I'd be interested in writing a mini series based on the stories of a sports agent. Now, that no sports agent stuff had been done yet. This is before Jerry Maguire and everything. So, I wasn't the first person to ever, but it was the first time anybody series had done it and stuff like that. I mean, I'd seen little things maybe. So they liked that idea, and we were sold to HBO, and I wrote a pilot, and then I wrote some other episodes, bada bing, bada boom. And it took about 2 or 3 years for it to finally get on the air. And, I said, I want to tell this through the eyes of a self-promoting, self-aggrandizing sports agent and somebody coined a phrase who was ethically challenged. And it was a good catchphrase. And I got to doing research. I got to meet most of the big sports agents. Arn Kellum, the guy who wrote the book, Mike Trope, he had written a book about sports agents beforehand. Dennis Gilbert, Alex Katz. I mean, I've met most of them. I met Scott Boris later. But I met most of them for the stories. But I was also writing a story about a guy who ran a business. My father, I come from a family business. So he was a guy running a small business. And he just had a very unique clientele. And again, an agent is an agent. Agents by nature are parasitic because they're taking a percentage, a fee for what they get work or what somebody else does or something like that, but they take a fee for that. So by nature, it's a bit parasitic. I hate to use totally that word because they are doing a service. And I also, an agent is an agent, whether it's a real estate agent, a theatrical agent, a sports agent. An agent's an agent. And it was about a guy running a business, and that's pretty much. And I had leeway at HBO because a guy I started with was the head of HBO at the time, Chris Albrecht, and he gave me leeway. And I did not care about big games or anything like that. Ron Shelton, who did Bull Durham, we always talk about what the reason most sports movies suck is because they're always told from the point of view of the fan. And the fan only cares about one thing: did the team win or lose? They don't give a shit about anything else. They don't care how they got there. They don't care what they did to do it. They don't care if they got they don't care. Fans don't care. Ron was an athlete. He said, I don't know what the fan thinks. I know what the guy at second base is thinking because I played second base. He goes, I'm trying to keep my job. And so I wrote it from a guy who's trying to keep his job. And I don't buy into all this goody two shoes ideas about sports. My dad was an athlete. My dad was into sports. Told me about sports, and the great things I learned from him about athletes. A lot of things because he was an athlete. One was how superstitious they are. Number two is Whenever anybody tells you the old story, when anybody else tells you it's not about the money, it's always about the money. And when he talked about that, ball players don't think the way fans think. They just don't think. It just doesn't come into their minds. They don't think like that. Basically, a very conservative world. There was one time when there was a poll taken during our show about they asked 100 top PGA pros about their political parties, and the vote was 99-1 Republican. So you're dealing with that's golfers. That's really that's the most Republican sport. But you're dealing with basically conservative people in sports. They just are. I mean, just the nature of what they do. It's like a military. Not all of them, but as far as that goes. So that's how. And I just had to write stories, and I was also. It's a world I knew something about. It's a world I knew something about. So that's how it started anyway. That was the genesis.
And coming from a comedian background, you obviously implemented comedy into the show Arliss, and it found a very interesting balance between kind of portraying sports reality and then bringing in this comedic idea to the whole show. Obviously, a big example is in the episode with Barry Bonds. He's rounding the bases and he slides in a third plate, and then you're sitting with the team's owner in the stands, and you call him, and it's obviously like not reality, but it adds this comedic value to the show. So how did you really find this true balance between making it something that making it something relatively realistic, but at the same time adding your own spin to it to make it good television?
Good question. However, that was a commercial. That was a promo.
Yeah.
That was not an episode. That would never happen in an episode because it wasn't real. It's like I had to stay within the bounds of reality. I mean, it was entertainment, but that was a commercial. That was a promo for HBO to start the show. That was not an episode. That would never happen in an episode. So, how do I stay real? Well, because it's human nature. I'm a big fan, a big study of human nature and of business and of sports and of people, and that's how. I mean, I don't know that we ever. I don't know if we ever stretched reality in the show. That's not. We would set up situations, but I don't know if we ever. I'm trying to think of a time I ever really stretched reality. I don't think I.
Or where not necessarily stretch reality, but just involved comedy to make it more.
Well, comedy's writing. I mean, that's just writing. Comedy is just right. It's all drama. Under drama, you have the two masses, comedy and tragedy. I mean, it was a comedy. It was always entertainment. We got more serious. We had more serious storylines as the show went on, just for depth and giving it much more depth. And also the show evolved, and good shows should evolve, and they should grow. It is an organic process. But no, the comedy is very real. It was satire. Satire is really what it was.
Mm-hmm. And I know it's a common thing in the show and movie industry to, not a common thing, but it happens relatively often where the writer of the show, the creator of the show, is in the show, but you weren't only in the show, you were the main character of the show. So when you were really writing and when you were trying to figure out what the character development of Arliss Michaels would be, how did you really take into consideration your portrayal of that character when really coming up with its story?
It was there from the get-go. The HBO had a lot of success with that. You had Larry Sanders and Gary Shanley had done it before him. This was nothing new. I mean, going back to whether it's Jack Benny or any of that they did, a lot of guys. This was nothing new. That having the creator and star, especially in comedy, be the star of the show. And again, it's a world I knew. And also, we're coming off of Batman, which was a huge movie, and Bull Durham and a couple of things. So I had a track record. The owner, the head of HBO trusted me implicitly. And one of the things I'm most proud of, more than anything, as much as anything else and this is from a business point of view, I am positive. Oh yeah, I'm positive that we were the only HBO series possibly ever to come in on time and under budget. Ever. Because Sopranos was on and Sex and the City, and they were going tens of millions over. But I was always on time and under budget because of the business background.
Mhm. And really, a big part of this show and what made it so maybe very appealing to sports fans as well is the consistent cameos you had on there. I mean, you had Kobe Bryant, John Elway, Tiger Woods, Shaquille O'Neal, Al Michaels, Derek Jeter, and the list goes on and on. So what was it like really being able to immerse yourself in the sports world as such a big sports fans and really work with all these athletes and journalists?
Okay, well, to meet the athletes, working with the athletes is that's a big, you work with them at that time. The key with the athletes, to me, after the first, they were texture. They were nothing more than texture. Now, I loved having them on, and it gave us, we had fun with that. Most of the time, they weren't involved with the storylines.
Mhm.
They were, because the key is you can't ask somebody to do something they're not capable of doing. They're not actors.
Yeah.
So don't expect them to be actors. With rare exceptions, I expected, you expect more out of broadcasters because they're on camera, and I'm friendly with quite a few of them. So Charlie Steiner, Bob Costas, I have personal relationships. With the athletes, at first, it was, a little bit tougher pulling teeth. Once we got on the air and were successful, then, as Glenn Fry of the Eagles said, you were to athletes what Saturday Night Live was to a rock band. You wanted to get on Saturday Night Live. Athletes wanted to get on Arliss. That was a thing. So that came, and that evolved. Again, it was a bit of stunt casting, but again, it was great meeting him. I mean, it was great to meet him and fun. And we always, the shows were, with one or two exceptions, were never written for a specific athlete, ever.
Mhm.
It was always to be determined because most of it had to do with who's available. Who's on the West Coast? Who's on the West Coast? What teams are coming in? Who's playing there? We didn't have many golfers because golfers, we would shoot from like January, or February to about July, and that's their season. So but whoever was in town, there wasn't a lot of. Well, we had football players. We didn't have a lot of golfers. We didn't have a lot of tennis players, because their season was on then. But it was who in town. And they were most of them for the vast. They were all great. You know why? Because the good ones, the good athletes are coachable, which means they take direction. And the more times they would do something or do scene a couple of times, it's like doing reps. So the more times they do it, the better they're going to get, the easier they're going to be, the more natural it's going to be. So they were terrific. I was very fortunate.
Mhm. And obviously, you said you like working or meeting all of them and
Yeah.
really having them on the show. Did you ever have a favorite person to really meet?
I became friends with a couple. The one who I spent the most time with on the set, I got one autograph. We had 200. I got one autograph, and that was Jim Brown. Jim Brown was the most interesting because Jim Brown transcended. He was of my generation. When I was growing up, he was great on so many levels, and he was so great. He was, a great running back. Then he became a really successful movie star, and then he got involved with social programs. And he was controversial. He was the most interesting to me because of who he was and what he did. And we talked for hours that day. I enjoyed talking with Jim Brown a lot.
Mm-hmm. And you said that day when these athletes came on to set, was it you had them for a day and it was done?
No, we had him for about 2 hours.
And then they were.
Jim Brown was different because Jim Brown was retired.
Uh-huh.
If there was somebody who was, because they'd have to go to the ball game.
Yeah.
It became a scheduling problem at the time. Mm-hmm. I also got to like Roy Jones Jr. a lot, the boxer.
Uh-huh. Okay.
A lot of them I got to like.
Uh-huh. You definitely met your fair share of athletes through that show. It was really cool kind of going through the episodes and going through everything and seeing all the people that were featured. I mean, that's very neat. And it's not something really seen very much anymore where these athletes are consistently on the same, like there's one show that has this many athletes in it. So for any sports fans that are interested in this type of stuff, it's definitely good to go watch them and see all these athletes who they look up to and who they watched on television and in person. And I want to focus in on Bull Durham very quickly because it was a very, very, very famous sports movie, and it still is. I mean, it's still considered one of the biggest sports movies of all time, and it tells a very unique story. It talks about a minor league baseball team in Durham, North Carolina, And obviously, when you think of a sports film, you don't really think of a minor league team. You think more of a major league team. So what was that experience like for you, really covering, like really being part of something that had never been done before? I mean, when you think of baseball movies, you don't think of the minor league systems. And so I feel like portraying that was very unique, and it at least it gives me a new look on what minor league baseball is. And I'm wondering if, because you were part of it, whether or not it does for you.
There had been one or two other minor league stories, but it's Ron Shelton. Again, he wrote and directed, and he lived it. So he knew that. And minor league, you could tell a story because they're not. It's more about dreams in a certain way. It's about a guy who's got dreams, and they're not going to be fulfilled. And he's a smart guy, but he just doesn't have the talent, as opposed to somebody who is so gifted and doesn't have a clue.
Mhm.
But they're gifted. And that's the nature of sports sometimes. Um, Talent generally wins. If I got more talent than you, most of the time I'm going to win. I'm going to beat you. The talent will out in sports most of the time. Um, like coaches and managers, depending on the sport, they're important, but for the most part, they don't make or break teams. They don't. I mean, they're better. Obviously, they're important. And there's some managers who are obviously much better than others. But you give me a lousy manager who's got a lot more talent than a great manager who's got no talent, and I'll take the lousy manager and the talent every time. Talent wins most of the time.
I'm wondering what really goes into creating a great sports movie, in your opinion? I mean, obviously are a trillion factors that can go into it,
Who's
but
telling the story? First and foremost, who's telling the story? Because that's the question you have to ask. Whose point of view are we seeing? Who's telling the story? In Bull Durham, it's a woman.
yeah.
She's telling the story. Annie's telling the story.
Mhm.
So and what point of view is she telling? Now she's telling it from a fan's point of view,
Mhm.
but the storytelling is not from a fan's point of view. It's from somebody who's been there. That's very important. And again, and you like them for different reasons. I mean, sports movies, like most of the ones that I really like, uh, they're just not about. Usually, it never comes down to the big game.
Mhm.
Like Ron, there's no big games. That's all full of shit. Um, Most of the ones that I like fall into that category. What takes great? And by the way, what makes a great sports movie? Like any other story, great characters. Great characters. That's what you remember in any story, in any movie. You remember great characters.
Something that I think is interesting, and I think has been made like very, very, very clear, especially in the current movie industry, is that in terms of sports movies, when successful sports movies are never about the actual sports, like you were saying. It is about the stories of the characters and about the
That's right.
setting and
That's
about the
right.
situation, about the community.
That's right.
And so, like you were saying, it kind of gives this whole different perspective of what sports means to people, because like you were saying, it's never told from a fan's perspective, because that's what you see on a daily basis through sports. So
Right.
really seeing the behind the scenes and everything that's what makes film overall very impactful in our society, and what helps make sports film very popular as well.
Yeah, you said it. I mean, again, but then you get people who want to, it is a business. So let's like,
Yeah.
there are the entertainment business here. So you have to keep that in mind.
And so, yeah, so you've been involved in sports movies that really tell the stories of everything really other than the actual games. I mean, in Bull Durham, it's the games are involved, the sport like baseball is involved, but when baseball's involved, it is still the story, especially of the catcher and the pitcher, not specifically what they're doing together, but kind of how they combine to affect each other's careers and the roles that they have on each other. And so I I would love if you talked a little bit about like what film sports film, even though it is part of the entertainment industry, can really do for sports fans? How can it really affect a fan, or really just those involved in sports?
I think you tell your story and tell the story you're trying to tell. Um, I mean, sports fans are. See, the thing about sports fans, there's difference. Do you love the sport or do you love a team? If you're blind to a team, I find that even though we all do it, problematic because you have to remember something in the big picture. These are all monopolies. All these professional teams are part of a monopoly. The NBA, the Major League Baseball, the NFL, you can't start a team to join their league. It's a monopoly. That's why they cost billions of dollars. There's only a few of them. So, and there's only one per city for most of the cities. Maybe New York and LA or two, but everything else is one team. You get to that, and if you're going to now, the guy who owns the team could be the biggest asshole in the world. Why do I want to root for this asshole to make money? Why do I want this guy who is could be a racist? He can be an anti-Semite. He can be everything. Why am I rooting for his product to be successful just because he happens to own the one franchise of my city? You know, I see that's a dangerous place to be. That's interesting to me. It's like, why am I rooting? And they say, well, you root for the name on the front of the uniform rather than the name of the back. Yeah, but unless the front of the uniform is owned by a guy who's a bad guy, why am I rooting for this guy's business? I wouldn't root for another business, but because it's a monopoly, that's the conundrum. You know, that's the conundrum. So why, and people, and I find that my dad used to say it all the time. What do they ever do for you? What do these teams ever do for you? And there's a lot of truth in that. Now, if it's a guy you like, if you like the way the owner runs a team, then that's great. That's great. But that's a dangerous place. There's a great, there's a great movie, one of my favorite movies, a movie called Big Fan.
Mm-hmm.
Big Fan is a terrific little film starring Patton Oswalt. Came out in like 2009. And it's about an obsessive talk show caller.
Yeah.
And a huge New York Giant fan who is one day beaten up by his biggest hero. And the choices and the reaction he makes afterwards. It's a great film. This talks. There's no game in it. I don't think they do a tailgating session because that's what they do. He couldn't afford tickets, but they would go tailgate. But that's an interesting film. I like that film a lot because it's about something. I like that. That talks about the nature of sports and the nature of sports fandom, and I like that a lot. And it's a dark film, and it's short, but I really like it. You can get it on Amazon, Roku, or Tubi, whatever it is, Tubu, whatever it is. So that's one I really like. That's a good sports film to me. That's underappreciated, something you should see. It went under the radar, and that's a good film because that goes into, most of them are, I'm trying to think of, a lot of them are about the triumph of the spirit stuff. Okay, it's like that's Hoosier stuff. And Rudy, yeah, they're fine. They're fine. I think they're, especially Hoosiers is a mediocre film that's elevated by a great performance, a couple of great performances. I mean, it's based on a true story, which means anything. But here's the thing. Whenever you see any movie where somebody in a locker room or someone starts to go, and then somebody else starts going like this, right? Turn it off. It's full of shit. I've never seen that. No one has ever seen that in a locker room where one guy starts and then another guy starts and then five other guys start and then everybody starts talking. That's total bullshit. That happens only in a movie. As soon as you see something like that, the movie's full of shit.
And at the same time, and at the same time, do you think that part of, even though sports has to find the realistic, in order to continue portraying what sports is in real life, it has to maintain this idea of reality. But at the same time, do you think that really involving this idea of this power of sports, this uniting power of sports that brings people together from everywhere, do you think that can be promoted through good films? Is that a good way?
I think so. As long, yeah, I mean, bringing people together. I think the only one to bring it together are fans of that team. Bringing people together, if they're sports fans, yeah, and they can watch, yeah, they can like a sports fan movie. But if you like cars, you like Fast and the Furious movies. I mean, um, a movie is a story. I mean, that's entertainment, and of course, and you can't put the same. I mean, Major League is a different style than Bull Durham. They're both successful. They're both at the same time. One's a broad comedy. One is a big broad, which is great, and the other is more of a comedy drama and has a lot more depth. I mean, the other one is a big broad comedy. And Bull Durham isn't that. Cobb certainly isn't that. But Cobb wasn't successful. The fans, again, it's the fan term. I mean, it's again, it's like, don't see this through the eyes of the fan.
Would you would you overall consider yourselves a sports fan, or would you
Sure,
consider? Yeah.
sure.
And you grew up. I know you grew up in New Jersey. Then you went to the University of Houston,
Yeah,
and then now live in Los Angeles. Has your fandom for sports evolved over time, or have you
absolutely.
maintained the same favorite teams
Absolutely.
and everything?
Yes and no. I grew up being a Jet. Well, I grew up first. I was a Yankee fan, and then the Mets came. So I root for. I have a theory now that I subscribe to is life is always better when the home team wins, which I believe is right. Life is better when the home team wins. I don't mean that just in sports. I mean that in family. I mean that in business. I mean that in politics. It's better. Life is better when the home team wins. It just is. If our team wins, good. I did. I grew up a Yankee fan, and then but I grew up in New Jersey, which is the metropolitan area. So when the Mets won, that was the hometown team too. So and then I went to school in Houston, and I used to sell beer in the Astrodome. And then so I became I wanted the Houston Astros to win because I was there for a lot of years and I sold beer and I worked for them. And then when I come out here, I was a season ticket holder to the Dodgers. So I was a Dodger. And to this day, I'm really not a huge Dodger fan. I mean, that's not in my blood. Now, I root for the Dodgers a lot because a lot of my friends work for them, and it's their business, some of them, and I want my friends' business to do well. Same thing with the Angels. I like the Angels too. I mean, again, home team. I also root for good organizations. I've always liked to see organizations like the Cardinals, and I respect them year after year. Having a bad year, but they're a good organization. I like old school baseball stuff from I like to see Cincinnati doing well and Baltimore doing well because I grew up with them. Uh, the Jets I grew up being a huge Joe Namath fan, so I became a Jets fan at the age of 13, 14. And this is something different because even though there's a part of me, it has an emotional pull to the Jets, it's been the most incompetent, pathetic organization for 50 years. So, yeah, so and here's the other thing. All these people, with the exception of owners, they change teams. They change teams. So I'm a big believer in the individual. So if my friend changes teams, I'm not going to root for him to do well. If my friend, I'm Buck Showboard is a friend. I want the Mets to do well. Jerry DiPoto is a great friend of mine, so I want the Seattle Mariners to do well. I'm friendly with Charlie Stein. Life is better when the home team wins. So and if they change teams, so what? I want my friends to do well. I don't buy into this. It's like my goddaughter uh, grew up. Her mom was from the Boston area, and so she grew up being a huge Red Sox fan, huge. And when she was in school at Syracuse, she got an internship with the New York Yankees, and all her Boston Red Sox fans. How can you possibly go to work for the New York Yankees? She had the best answer of all time. She goes, Babe Ruth did. Johnny Damon did. I mean, all these guys, it's like, it's a business. Stop thinking of it as anything else but a business. You're playing a game, you love the game, you love the sport, but it's a business.
Hmm. And in Arliss, you really explore that idea of
Yeah,
it being a business,
absolutely. Well, it's
because
crazy.
yeah, because you were made. I mean, it was a sports agency. I mean, its job is to be involved in business. That is the role of a sports agent, to be that connector between organizations and players. And so you had a. I feel like that's what makes that show so interesting and unique, because you don't see TV really embracing this idea of sports to completely being a business, because you want to make it more entertaining. You want to make it, I don't know, more heartfelt for the viewer, rather than just talking about the business side. So how did you really engage your viewership by still making it have that heartfelt feel, but still involving the business of sports?
Well, because you can do that because as long as you make it, you have to have an emotional reason. It's emotion, and it's never about a contract or numbers. Numbers have no emotional value. What's the difference of somebody if he raises if he's going to get 500 million or 600 million? What's the difference emotionally? None. So you have to involve them emotionally. For example, again, that a difference between a $300 million contract and a $400 million contract isn't going to affect, our establishment. But if you take away his courtside seats at the Laker game, yeah, that's affecting him emotionally. If you're taking away Rita's frequent flyer miles, that's emotional. That ain't about how many points somebody scored. That's what because people can relate to that. They can relate to getting the courtside seats, even though they can relate to having them taken away. They can relate to frequent flyer miles. They can relate to friendships, and they can't relate to being up at the bottom of the ninth with 2 men on. No, who's going to relate to that? And also people think you got to get rid of this idea that because people have played sports growing up and they played baseball, they played basketball, that it's anything like what these guys are doing at their level. It's not. It's a different world. It's like saying, it's like, this is an extreme example, but I made a paper airplane. I made it fly. Okay, now I'm piloting a rocket ship. It's a different world. What the game they play is not the game that the people grew up with. It's the best ball player who was on your high school team couldn't make a minor league team, more than likely. And that's a minor league team. They're a different type of athletes. They're different. Um, the other thing I learned, the one thing I did learn about professional athletes, is when it comes to their skills, their basic skills, with rare exceptions, there's about this much difference between all of them. What separates the guy good from the superstar is what's going on up here.
Mhm.
What's going on up here, and a little bit up here. But what's going on up here? Their mental approach to the game. How much mentally have they prepared for for every possible situation to come up? And what would they do because when that are they prepared for when that situation comes up? And it will come up.
Mhm.
Are you mentally prepared for the moment? That's what separates these guys.
Mhm.
The ones who can beat you before you step on the field.
Mhm. And I want to talk about more your the opportunities you've gotten to really be like to talk sports in a more public setting. I mean, I'll get into it in a second, but you made some appearances on the show Boomer and Carton, and you also made some appearances on ESPN when you were on the 2 minute drill, and you really got to combine your loves for both film and sports in a very professional setting like that, a very official setting on ESPN. And so, what was the best or most rewarding part about doing that show for you?
Oh, I like that. I like doing the people. I like talking sports. Yeah, I do. I like talking professional sports. I did work in college with intramurals and the University of Houston sports, and but professional sports are a whole different game. It's a whole different world. You got to remember too something else about professional athletes. again, they're, for the most part, for the vast majority, their careers are very short. The average athlete's career is less than 5 years.
Mhm.
Think about that.
Yeah.
And they're never probably going to ever hit those heights again.
Mhm.
So that's another interesting thing to me. That was another interesting thing. It also was a sexy world to do the show because they were young, it's attractive, it's sexy, there's a lot of money. They're stars. And so that was something else too.
Mhm. And then on Boomer and Carton, when you filled in for Boomer on that show, and you also hosted your own daily talk show in 2011 on the radio. So, what was it like as someone passionate about sports? What was it like to have that platform to really discuss sports in that way? That was
I
both.
was just having fun on my sports show, the Westwood One show. It was unfortunate; it wasn't successful at all. When you're doing a sports show, you better be have an interaction with people. And we weren't live, so I didn't have any callers to bounce off of. So it was all guest oriented or just opinion, and I wasn't great at that. Boomer Cartons is different because Cartons is great. Cartons is great radio, and I just give my opinions, and it was also comedy. It was also fun. Um, and also, it's New York based, and I know that world. I know New York. By the way, I don't know baseball. I know football. I know. Then basketball a little bit, but I don't know. Golf I know a little bit, but I don't know all sports. Hockey I don't know much about the sport itself. Other sports, but but the business is the same. Supply and demand. The business is the same.
And to conclude, your alma mater, the Houston Cougars, which I'm guessing you're a very big fan of, and
Oh,
you got the distinguished alumni award, I think in 2012, correct?
yeah.
Um, and so
I
and
didn't
so
graduate. Basically, did an alumni award. We didn't graduate. But go ahead.
and so they've been increasingly successful in college sports. Obviously, they were probably had their most successful era when they had Hakeem Olajuwon and Clyde Drexler. But nowadays, I mean, they just made the move to the Big 12. So I think it became official on July 1st of this, like 13 days ago. So what was your reaction when that happened? Because I know that you must have been a big supporter of that, and you really probably believe Houston needs to be on that wider.
Right. Again, that was all business. That's all business. I mean, when I was in college, the big thing was to get into the Southwest Conference, which no longer exists, and University of Texas would keep them out business wise. Texas is the big dog there, and so they were kept out of that conference for many years. And then when Texas was at they don't get into the Big 12 if Texas doesn't leave. Texas wasn't going to allow them in. They don't want the rivalry. They don't want the competition. They never have. I'm happy about that. Elijah. There's been two pure Olajuwon Drexler, yes, but there's also. Now remember, before that, Houston won the most famous college basketball game of all time.
Yes, yeah, that's true.
So they packed the Astrodome at a time, and no one ever thought that could happen.
Yeah, that
So,
was
and then you go up and down. Now they have a great coach. They have a great coach in
Samson.
yeah, right. Kelvin Sampson, of course. Thank you. He's a terrific coach. So that and I like the way they play ball too. So I think now they're going into the Big 12, which was already the best basketball conference last
Yeah.
year, and now you're adding Houston. That's going to be exciting because of the traditions.
Mm-hmm.
That will be, that'll be exciting because of, I mean, playing Kansas. I mean, and those, Kansas basketball is a big deal.
Baylor too. They're good.
Baylor, I mean, but the tradition of Kansas basketball. I mean, Kansas like Indiana.
Yeah.
I mean, Duke. I mean,
Yeah.
Kansas. It's going to be fun. I think they're not going to be undefeated in that conference. I can tell you that.
No, yeah,
That's
that'd
not
be
going to happen.
I mean, yeah, they were a one seed this past year.
Yeah.
I think I had them going a little bit farther in my March Madness bracket than they ended up doing, but it'll be fun to see them hopefully be a high seed in the tournament again, and they will definitely have your support, which is pretty cool. And so Mr. Wall, yeah.
Football is going to be a tougher road.
football is going to be a tougher road, especially because the Big 12 is very focused on
Yeah,
that too as
and they're
well.
not as good in football as they are in basketball.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're good in basketball.
Perfect. Thank you very, very much, and
Sure.
have a great one, and I appreciate it.